I'm Josh Harris, and you're listening to Clear and Loud, a podcast about the ideas, stories, and voices that are shaping our world. Today, I'm having a conversation with Nelson Boschman, who is a writer, spiritual director, retreat facilitator, jazz musician, and wine enthusiast. He is a pastor who really enjoys a good glass of wine and decided to write a book about the intersection of these two ideas, the journey of a grape becoming wine and the journey of the soul. Nelson lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, so he's in my city. He's the pastor of spiritual formation at Artisan Church, which I've attended several times. Really thoughtful guy. I really appreciate the way he thinks about faith, the way he thinks about spiritual transformation, and the way he lives a contemplative life. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. Hey, Nelson.
Hello, Josh. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for coming on the podcast to chat with me. I really appreciate it.
That's an honor and a privilege. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
It's a little bit of an interesting day for me. You know, you're an advocate and practitioner of contemplative living. I don't feel very contemplative right now because it's been a very busy morning. I became a Canadian citizen today. So
Whoa.
I had my yeah.
That's huge.
I had my my oath swearing in ceremony with my youngest kiddo, and we both did that together. And there were people from 34 different countries, and we all came together and swore our oath to King Charles and to be good Canadians. It was actually a very touching and powerful moment. So I'm just a little bit I'm a little scattered and like overwhelmed. But it's great to get to talk. I need a glass of wine, actually. I think is what I need.
And we should have arranged for that. Yeah. That's great.
We really should have. Your book in reference to wine, The Growing Season, is all about drawing parallels between wine and Christian spirituality. And I'm just curious, like, when did you first start making connections between those two seemingly different topics? What's the backstory on that?
Yeah, I mean, really big picture, macro backstory. It was Jesus's fault first. I mean, Jesus is the one who, said, "This is my body. This is my blood broken for you." And he shared wine with disciples, at the Last Supper. And there's other places where he talks and referred to himself as vine and y'all as branches and those sorts of things. And then even going back into the Hebrew scriptures, wine has been a symbol of flourishing and abundance and beauty and like fertility and, some of these bigger pictures. So certainly because I identify with the Christian faith and in particular, increasingly so with the contemplative streams of that faith, it's just been latent. It's just sort of in me for a good while. But then,
just let me interrupt you here for a second, because what I'm realizing is, like, those are all such obvious connections.
Yeah.
But I'm realizing that maybe just because of the particular family I grew up in or the Christian tradition that I grew up in, wine is not front and center. Maybe people don't drink, there are different convictions there around that. And it's just funny how when you just list those off, I'm like, oh, well, yeah. But I realized that it was sort of downplayed in my religious upbringing. So as you're saying it, I'm like, oh yeah, those are a lot of really obvious ones.
Totally. And to be fair, those families that we grew up in, there are excesses, and those are outlined in the scriptures as well. And we know them just from lived experience.
Sure.
And I even
excesses of drinking alcohol or whatever,
misuse.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And overuse and whatever. And so I wanted to be careful actually to include a chapter around that. That's I just called the shadow side, and just to acknowledge that that's
Interesting.
there, but also
Yeah.
to make a case that if people are arguing against drinking, period,
Yeah.
you're not going to find that in the whole testimony of Scripture. It
Mm.
does not. There's no so thou shalt never drink. And so again, as we see Jesus's life, being called a drunkard and a glutton occasionally because of the company he kept.
Interesting.
That's instructive to me. Anyway, but yeah, for me, so the metaphor was there in Scripture, and then the actual kind of substance, of course, was there as well. And then I just became um, a growing enthusiast around wine. We had some really good friends who moved up to the
Mm.
Okanagan
Mhm.
decade or so ago, probably 13 years ago. And we just needed to visit them. And then I realized that one of my favorite things to do was to just go around and to taste wine. And I would say that like the Okanagan Valley within BC sort of is was in a coming of age as well, because it's a relatively
Wow.
young wine region compared to the rest of the
Mm.
world. Um, but man, they were figuring out how to make some really good wine. And so I just I really love doing this. And so I began to enjoy wine myself. And
Right.
then as a pastor, as a contemplative, really just seeing, I love wine as a metaphor, and I also love it for its own sake, and what it opens up in terms of human
So
connection
it wasn't
and
like this really
possibility.
elaborate like need to spiritualize wine. You genuinely
No,
Yeah,
not at
I'm
all.
totally kidding. I'm totally
Yeah,
kidding.
exactly.
But unpack some more of the metaphor.
Yeah.
Because you kind of think through uh the whole process, the whole journey, if you will, of a grape, of the growth and
That's
so
right.
on, and then how that ties into your understanding of human spirituality and so on. What are some of those key metaphors that are really
Yeah,
meaningful to you?
absolutely. Yeah. And so it just sort of opened up when I began to think, yes, there are a few of those particular scriptural connections.
Mm,
That, pruning is mentioned and those sorts of parts of the process, vineyard kind of management and
mm,
care. But man, what if we backed up right to soil and dirt and thought about
mm,
place and origin and
mm,
how that shapes how vines grow and how grapes grow and how this fermented grape juice eventually gets made. And to ask again on a metaphorical, personal, spiritual sense,
mm,
what does my own somewhereness, which is an American wine writer's translation of the word terroir, that the French say terroir, which has everything to do with place and
interesting.
the factors that contribute to a wine, climate, all of those sorts of things. Um, so that's one level of engagement that we open the book with. Well, it's called somewhereness. And so what's my own somewhereness? How has that shaped who I've become?
Mm,
And
mhm.
what do we learn from the winemaking process? And then we move into the vineyard and we ask questions about pruning. We ask questions about pests management and control. And in the Okanagan Valley, I talked to a French winemaker who said, one of the biggest threats was bears that would come down into the vineyards. And I'm like, oh, I'm thinking like small pests, but like no, bears and deer who
Wow.
like chomp on the fruit,
Wow.
and
Yeah.
what it takes to keep them out. Parallels to all kinds of things. What are the circumstances we can't control in our own growth and flourishing that we have to sort of
Yeah.
prepare for and think about going from
Mm,
there to harvest, which one of the colloquialisms for harvest is just the big crush. It's when the fruit gets crushed. And so there's
yeah.
images of suffering and yeah, and that was a tricky chapter to write as well, because so much of Christian theology would want us to believe that, oh yeah, all suffering has meaning. And man, I don't know, read the book of Job
Mm,
and we might
mm.
beg to differ with that. So I think, so not to say all suffering has meaning, but maybe there's such a thing as um, redemptive, or
Yeah.
suffering that is redemptive or can produce something else. And so to think about that from a wine standpoint and from a personal spiritual standpoint.
So
And we
that
move into the
moment of
cellar. Yeah. And we go into, we
just to pause for
just go,
one
yeah.
second, because I wanna draw this out a little bit more. Um, that moment which, like, I kind of picture the wine, the grapes being crushed. I mean, I guess I'm, like, picturing something from a movie, some old, some Italians tromping around,
Yeah.
crushing the grapes, which it feels like, this celebratory moment, this beautiful moment.
Hmm.
You're actually saying metaphorically, if you're a grape, that's not the best moment of your of your journey. There's
Totally. Yeah.
pain there. There's,
Yeah.
you're suffering in a sense. And so
That's
you're
right.
you're you're comparing that to the things we go through in life that seem like they're just the end.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then as like in the case of wine, there's something beautiful eventually gets created out of this, like the life
Mm,
emerges from death.
mm,
And again, which isn't to say that's the formula. You can expect this to happen,
sure.
but what if the trajectory ultimately is life?
Yeah.
And that, yeah.
And
So
then keep going with the journey of
yeah, well
the
then we
wine at
move
this point.
once the fruit gets crushed and pressed and it starts fermenting. Um, and then usually there's an aging process, which can be anywhere from a couple of weeks or a couple of months to even a couple of years. And so there's
Mm,
some sort of an aging vessel. And so if we think about barrels or oak barrels, and often red wines are aged for 12, 18 months, even longer than that. And
mm,
so this wondering of like, what all goes on in there? And there are things we can know, and there's
yeah,
things that we can't know.
yeah.
So some things that we test as well. So we pull samples out and we say, well, in this stage, 6 months into the process, what's the wine tasting like? What if we blended this barrel, which was harvested from that vineyard, and blended it with this one? And
Mm,
might that create something even more pleasing? So the winemakers who are attending to these nuances of, again, things that you
mm,
can know and can't know, won't
yeah.
know until you sort of pull samples out. But to think about what is our relationship to mystery as
Mm,
human beings? What are the uncertainties, pandemics,
yeah.
that hit us out of nowhere and yet have causes, of course, and there's reasons for them. But at the same time, the unknowing that creates, and what's our relationship to that? How do we live
Mm,
well with uncertainty or make friends with uncertainty and mystery? And can that actually be something that gives life rather um, than steals it from us? So
that's
there's
really
that
powerful.
process. Yeah. And then
Yeah.
once the wine is in the bottle, and then there's another phrase that the psalmists use is to taste and see. And so
Mm,
what's the role of celebration and savoring and really appreciating and knowing? And does that have something to say about how we engage with other people? The
mm,
curiosity with which we open a bottle of wine and wonder about it and enjoy it and appreciate it. And
mm,
um, yeah, then there's a chapter on winter. What about fallowness? What about silence? What about seasons where it's not, I'm not being invited to really produce, but rather to
mm,
rest and to attend to self care so that,
mm.
when the right season sort of comes along, I can be ready for it. So yeah, all kinds of sort of ways
I love
that
it.
this wine metaphor has been instructive for me and hope to my readers.
Just stepping back and thinking about metaphor overall, um, why do you think it's important for us as humans? I mean, you're coming from
Yeah.
the Christian tradition, which is filled with different metaphors, but like for you, there's something powerful about mapping the journey of wine onto
Yeah.
the life journey and so on.
Right.
How does that function for you personally?
Right. That's a great question. And I think, yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is in how it has shaped my understanding of faith and theology. And one of the formative moments for me was to study the book of Psalms, which is this ancient prayer book.
Mhm.
And I, not with Eugene Peterson himself in person, but through his writing.
Hmm.
And he has several chapters and really has attuned to, as a poet and a theologian, he has attended to the nuances of metaphor.
Hmm.
And someone, might have been him, might have been somebody else, who articulated, sometimes we're almost embarrassed as people of faith at the amount of metaphor there is within the scriptural writings.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm like, maybe I am, but I don't want to be.
Hmm.
I feel like there was something in me that needs, like you said, like I need metaphor. I need something that is concrete,
Mhm.
um, to, yeah, to help, I guess. Embodiment is important. So this is not just
Mm.
an idea, this faith that I ascribe
Right.
to. It's actually
Right.
meant something that's to be lived out.
Mhm.
And then just how it helps me to attune to the wider created order. So it isn't
Mm.
just human beings that count, but it's
Yeah.
also the non-human and my relationship to that. also
Mm.
matters. And I think that has something to do with how to be just a responsible human being. So I think we have
That's
to
so
attend to
good.
that. Yeah.
When you think about the different parts of the wine metaphor, um, which of those was most profound for you personally, or whether that's most challenging, most comforting, whatever it might be?
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So what's jumping out is probably early on. There's two chapters that are kind of centered in the vineyard. Chapter 2 is called The Fine Line. Chapter 3 is called Little Foxes.
Mm,
And so that the latter is a little bit more about these things that we can't control, these forces,
mm,
and how do we deal with them. The fine line refers to when you think about vineyard management and vineyard care, there's a fine line between doing things to the vines
mm,
and allowing vines to do their own work.
mm.
So when I think about and imagine myself as on the branch or being part of that growing organism,
Yeah.
that seems to be one that's keeps sticking with me. And this tension, this constant push pull between um, allowing, having in my sense, my sense of God, the divine love, doing things to
Mm,
me, creating
mm,
environments in which I can grow and change and get better.
mm,
Um, But then part of that divine work or the work of other people around me is also to let me do my own work. And
mm,
so discerning both what is mine to do, what's mine to carry, to take
mm,
on, to take control of, and what is mine to just to open to. And so that's a pretty rich one that stays with me, and
mm.
it just morphs and changes depending on what the season is. So right now it's parenting. And so my
Yeah.
wife and I, who have a 7-year-old, who possibly might be neurodivergent,
Mm,
and so learning what she needs, and then in the process, what we need, what's the work I need to do to attend to the way her brain is wired, the way my wife is wired, all of those sorts of things. And so it's this recognition, I think even in itself is helpful to recognize that
mm.
it's not all mine,
Right.
to do. It's not all on me entirely, but, and where is the work is to simply open and to receive, to pay attention.
Well, that insight, it really leads to a kind of a category of conversation that I'd love to have with you
Yeah.
as a pastor. I visited your
Yeah.
church
Hmm.
several times here in Vancouver, Artisan Church, which is a wonderful place, and the atmosphere of the church has felt to me, and this ties into the point you're making about that fine line, or is it the thin line or the fine line?
Yeah. The fine line. Yeah.
The fine line.
Yeah.
Of just how much you control and how much you just leave to the process and the growth of the vine and so on. And you can apply that in so many different settings. But when I
Absolutely.
think about the church setting, I get the sense when I go into Artisan that there's not this tightness of, okay, we got to control this. We got to control where people are. We have to, you know, kind of shape and be so I don't even know what the right word is, active to make sure that people are at the right
Hmm.
place and that people are thinking the right things and growing in the right ways and so on. And that's really what's enabled me as someone who, um, at best is questioning, is very
Yeah.
uncertain about my relationship to the Christian faith.
Totally.
Um, I just would imagine that that principle really comes into play for you as a pastor because I just feel that freeness and that kind of confidence and trust that you have in whatever God wants to be doing in different people and whether or not they believe in God and so on. And so I'm just wondering how that's come into play for you as someone who's supposed to be, leading a spiritual community.
Totally.
What
Oh
is
my
that
goodness.
like when you're leading that and you've got people coming from all different places, not on the same page, not believing, in the same way you do? How do you just kind of exist in that without tightening up and feeling like you need to control that?
Totally. Yeah. Maybe what I'm most aware of as I sort of reflect on my lived experience and how that has sort of shaped how I think the church ought to be, how I want to be a pastor.
Mm,
Um, I've experienced both,
mm,
a rigid control in some settings and spaces. And I've also experienced a generous spaciousness,
mm,
on the flip side of that as well. In educational institutions, Christian seminaries, those sorts of places, in individuals, in spiritual directors. I've been
mm,
a directee for over 20 years, and it's a practice that is indispensable to me. And so the space that's created in those environments, um, just seems to be, and certainly infinitely more inviting. There's room for my questions. There's room for my doubts. And I
mhm,
don't see, I think, and maybe someone's just said this to me explicitly, halfway through my life or my early 20s or something, that doubt is not the antithesis of faith,
hmm,
but rather they're necessary for its growth
mm,
and its deepening and its flourishing. And so I just learned, and I was shaped, and I was encouraged. I was given space to have them.
right.
That connects also with space for emotions, period. So I've been in places where emotions tend to be just shut down or dismissed or viewed as
Mm,
dangerous or
mhm,
fleeting or whatever the language happens to be. And then I've experienced the opposite. And then I started to see that this more spacious, open, welcoming, okay with questions, okay with being in process,
mhm,
actually seemed to dovetail with my understanding of God and scripture quite a
mm,
lot more than
wow.
perhaps I had originally been led to believe. Like, there is a lot of questioning in that book. There is a lot of
Mm,
shouting at God and wondering about things, and people who have experiences that, don't line up with what they have been told is real about God.
mm,
So then what do you do with that? And that seems to be most of our lived experience. I love the little scripture in the Gospels where someone comes to Jesus and wants his son to be healed. And one of the responses is, well, everything's possible if you believe. And he says, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief.
mm,
I just think that's where most of us live,
mhm,
is right in the center of that on Holy Saturday. It's like, what just happened? And
mm,
what's to come now. So
mm,
I don't see any other way to be the church or to be a pastor to than to allow, and it's mine to allow. Like, people are going to
mm,
sort of come in with that anyway. So,
mhm.
man, we might as well get used to it. Again, just kind of make friends with it, and that is our lived experience. And
Well,
yeah,
I really appreciate that, your own experiences have shaped you and how you think about it, and then that's shaping the atmosphere that you and the team are creating at Artisan. It's very, very different than my past experiences, and it's just encouraging to know that, there are people like you that are trying to live and create communities in that kind of way. It's so encouraging. This podcast is sponsored by the creative agency Clear and Loud. Whatever your business's product, service, or idea, we believe clarity changes everything. We help you clarify your strategy, your brand messaging, and your online content so that you reach the right audience and grow your business. If you're frustrated by an ineffective website, if your message is jumbled and confusing, and you're not getting the traction you want with your marketing, let's talk. Schedule a free 30-minute consultation by visiting clearandloud.com. I'm just curious, when you think about the aging process of wine,
yeah.
um, when you think about your own evolution as a person of faith, how have you evolved and changed,
Mm.
in your faith from your earlier
Yeah,
days? Like if again, I'm mixing this wine metaphor. I'm really mixing it in.
totally. It's good. It's
But
great.
if
Yeah,
the
here for it.
if we tasted, Nelson Boschman 15, 20 years ago, like,
Right.
oh, here's his faith here, and compared to, the time that's passed and so on. How do you see that change for yourself?
Mhm. Yeah. I think there has been an increasing move toward really love as the locus of that faith, or as the center of that faith, as opposed
Mm,
to fear.
mm,
Also one of my favorite scriptures is that there is no fear in love, and
mm,
there is a perfect love that drives out fear. And then also connected with love are words like solidarity and liberation. And so when I see how Jesus was with people, um, who he chose to hang out with, to identify with, and on the other side, who is some of his harshest warning and language mm, yeah, words of correction were
mm,
for, was usually the religious insiders. It was the ones with power, and it
mm,
was the ones without power who were on the margins who he most clearly identified with.
mm,
And so it really has, my faith has become more Jesus centered,
mm,
and really the person of Christ as the interpretive lens through which I need to measure my understanding of God against at all times. And that's been hugely formative in the last, and more explicitly so probably in the last 5 or 10 years. Um, part of the big shaping as well was even attending a place like Regent College, which was not adhered to a particular denomination, but instead a whole, almost like your experience this morning, of so many nations represented, so many denominations represented, and to get a chance to be exposed to different traditions, different people from different parts of the
mm,
world and their lived
mhm.
experience. And so I just feel like my curiosity and my empathy began to expand and increase as well, and
That's
just
so
began
good.
to say, like, how, wow, to get curious instead of fearful or judgmental about difference.
Mm, mhm,
Um, that relates to, again, the journey that our church has been on around LGBTQ plus inclusion as well,
mm,
and to step into a place where we may not agree on everything, but wow, can we agree on the center of believing
yeah.
Jesus as embodying love and liberation and equality for all people and all of that stuff? So
That's so
it's a huge
powerful.
question. I feel like a few pints
Yeah,
or
no,
a few,
I mean, I
a
think
bottle could be,
that's an amazing
yeah,
answer, and, that, that move from fear to curiosity and empathy is a journey that's needed not just by people, you know, in in the church, it's not like we
that's right.
all can be in so many different places of belief, you know, uh, whether we practice, religion or not, or faith in any given way. Like, I feel like that call out of fear, scarcity,
Hmm.
us versus them,
Hmm.
like is a constant. It's like it's constantly needed in all of us
Totally.
to try to put ourselves in that position of openness and curiosity and warm-heartedness, love centered kind
That's
of
right.
approach to others, and it's
Yeah,
so easy to fall out of that. It's so easy to
absolutely.
to
And
lose that.
yeah, and you touched on, or even the word flourishing too, which is, it means a lot. And to ask, well, what does
Mm,
that even mean?
yeah.
Is a good exercise, because I think about again, an ancient Hebrew concept of shalom, which most often in scripture is translated as the word peace, but it
Mm,
means more than the absence of conflict. It means wholeness. It means, um, everything in its right place. I'm quoting Radiohead lyrics now. One of the podcasts that I've been listening to is doing a deep dive on Radiohead's Kid A. And so I've been just listening to everything in its right place. And
that's
so,
great.
but also not just in its right place, but in right relationship to
Yeah.
everything else. And
Mm,
so when I desire that flourishing, or can learn to move toward desiring your flourishing,
mm,
your wholeness, your sense
mhm,
of right relatedness with yourself, with the earth, with everybody sort of in your sphere of influence, and strangers that you don't even know yet. If you can
mm,
begin to say, I want yours as much as I want mine,
yeah,
there I think we're beginning to get towards something that
mhm.
might look like flourishing.
That's so
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, the interconnectedness
Mm,
is such a powerful reality that, again, we can slip away from and lose sight of, which is why I think it's so important, the immersing, what your book is doing, immersing people in the journey of
yeah.
this plant, which is so incredible that, I mean, I was thinking about this recently. This is a totally different topic. Maybe you'll write a book about psychedelic mushrooms in the future. I don't know, but
Totally
totally
will.
different, totally
Yeah.
different plant. But
Yeah.
in a similar way, the idea that these vines can grow and grapes can grow, and that humans figured out how to, crush them and allow the juice to ferment, and then that would interact with the human body and mind in a way that would bring, levity and joy, and like
Right.
that interconnectedness of nature and humans being a part of the, natural order. That's so mind-blowing when you really stop and think about it, and the fact that it
Yeah.
interacts with us in that way, and that, even wine itself is like this, it enables, it
That's right.
lubricates human interactions and human
Yes.
joy and so on,
Yeah.
is quite powerful. Like, when it comes to soil and plants and those types of things, like, did you have moments as you were writing where those connections were kind of blowing your mind a bit?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the other podcasts that I did, someone was asking similar questions. And it's like, there were moments where the awe was too big for me to say, I need to write about this or study this more. And part of it was maybe a drive to say, I'll never get this done if I start to open that
Yeah,
big
yeah,
theme of interconnectedness to all created things. Like that's just going to be too
yeah.
big. But at the same time, yeah, there were moments where I sort of sit back, and sometimes that happens in tasting and swirling wine in a glass and actually
Wow.
getting my nose in there and
Mm,
noticing the complexity and the layers that are there in a really, really good glass of wine.
mm,
And the moments of awe really open up there. I'm like, oh my goodness, who are we
yeah.
that we get to experience this? And it's just like, yes, this is incredible. What is going on here? And then there's a great moment at the end of there's a series of documentaries called Somm, short for sommelier. And
Mm.
Somm, like I think the first one is just called Somm, and then there's Somm 2 and Somm 3. And I can't remember at the end of one, there's a long montage of kind of just a visual representation of everything and all the ounces, the human labor that goes into a glass. And they just do it in a
Oh,
few
wow.
minutes. And it's this beautiful
This is like a
snapshot, right?
documentary that's on
Yeah.
some streaming service or something?
That's right. Yeah, I can't remember
Amazing.
which platform it's
Okay.
on, but it's really great. I feel like it's the second one. I need to go
Oh,
back and
neat.
check that, but it's maybe it lasts 5 minutes, but you get this little snapshot of
Yeah.
all that goes into this thing. And then
Yeah.
you can circle back to that bigger theme of like, oh, and then the connectedness even goes deeper and richer and wider
Mm.
than even that. This is just, yeah, it is mind blowing. Totally.
So
Yeah.
good. So good. That, that word that you consistently use,
Mm,
contemplative living, contemplative spirituality. What does that mean to you?
yeah. It's great. It feels like that question will probably be, as long as I keep writing books, there will be new layers of that just sort of
Mm.
opening up because it feels like, it's both something that can be said succinctly, but yet lived out and in flesh and embodied takes really a lifetime.
Mhm.
At its essence, I think of contemplative living as just sort of living with eyes open. It's living with
Mm.
awareness. Anthony DeMello, who's a more modern mystic, said awareness is all there is. The rest is up to God. And so what if that is the predominant spiritual practice that I'm invited into? So it's awareness of what's going on in me,
Mm.
awareness of what's going on out there in the world, what's going on in the, the communities and the people with whom I have connection and relationship. And,
Mhm.
so yeah, just being aware and then open. And so as concerns Christian, contemplative living through a Christian lens would be this baseline understanding and conviction, I would say, or might even
Mm.
use the word assurance.
Mm.
Um, I have an emerging allergy to the word certainty. But anyway, I'm just going to say I like assurance. I like conviction, the sense that the universe is ultimately friendly, that at the center
Mm,
of the universe is a relationship of love, that I
mm,
am created in the image of that divine sort of presence and essence and energy. And that is a part of just the core of who I am as a human being,
mm,
as a created being. And so that love is always moving toward me and not attempting to keep me at arm's length, or is not against me, is
mm,
for me at the core of who I am. And so my awareness begins there, to live with that awareness that I am beloved, and that
mm,
there isn't anything I need to do to achieve that. There isn't anything I could do to make it more than it
mm,
actually is.
mhm,
But my sense of being more beloved is more to do with a growing awareness of that. My understanding is it's not an existential, oh, it's increasing. God loves me more now than he did yesterday. It's like,
mm,
I think the mystics would argue. They would say, no, it's just, you're just becoming aware of it. And so, so that at its core is that sense that I'm loved by God, and that my work is to open to that,
mm,
and to be consistently aware of it, because there are a lot of forces that would want me to believe otherwise, or that would lead me to believe otherwise. My circumstances, and like, so, well, this doesn't feel very loving, this
yeah,
thing that happened to me. But what if the presence of love in the midst of that is shared tears? Or,
mm,
like a good friend would be with you if you're going through
mhm,
a rough time. It's just like, oh, that's what love is in that sense. Like, it's not an answer. It's not,
mm,
a fix, but it's
yeah.
presence. It's solidarity. Yeah.
For the person listening who, maybe they're not uh, ready to explore the Christian focus of
Yeah.
contemplative spirituality and so on, but they're drawn to that desire for greater awareness and so on. What are some simple steps in a more contemplative life that you would recommend?
Yeah. Oh, that's really good. What a great question. Thanks, Josh. Uh, Centering prayer is a practice that comes to mind. And at its core, it is sitting in silence and choosing a key word, or a phrase to sort of continually come back to.
Mm,
And so I might set my timer for 20 minutes. Um, and I choose that word, and the word it's not the content of the word that matters. It's the practice of returning to it when you
mm,
find your mind wandering or drifting. And
yeah.
so it's a way of practicing and centering in belovedness, to say, oh yeah, in silence, can I do this? Can I do this for 20 minutes a
Mm,
day, or even once a week or something, or even 5, like whatever time you have,
yeah.
to return to that, it's called a sacred word, or that sort of idea, as a way of reminding yourself of
Mm,
that, oh no, as you are where you are right now, you couldn't be more loved. You
mm,
couldn't be more valued. And so to practice that. And then there's a practice also called welcoming prayer, which is more like that kind of consent on the go, or like returning to belovedness as you're out and about and someone cuts you off in traffic, or like, oh, what's that emotion? Great. Yes. I'm loved here too. Right. Good. Okay. And I can let go and recognize
mm.
that. So that might be one thing to
Those are
consider.
wonderful. That's
Mm,
that's really powerful. I want to circle back to the topic of writing
yeah.
because a lot of what I talk about here on the podcast is related to people sharing a message,
Yeah.
with the world. Sometimes
Right.
that's very business focused, and we're talking
Mm,
about marketing. But I love, anytime I get to interact with someone who has an idea and they've had the courage to put it out into the world in whatever
right.
form. But you specifically have written a book, and I'm just curious what your writing process was like. What was it like to get into the rhythm, the discipline of writing? What did that, functionally look like in your schedule and your week or your month or year? What was it the writing journey
Yeah.
like?
Yeah. That's good. Um, Yeah, because there's a perfectionist sort of streak in me, the first thing that comes to mind was like, I really want to do this right. And so what do the experts say about writing process? And so
Yeah.
reading Anne Lamott, reading, some the artist's way or some of these other things and the kind of the classic advice on writing, and
Yeah.
people who are writers have inevitably heard, well, the most, what matters most is consistency. You
Yeah.
got to do it every day. And so, but then I also started to hear voices that would challenge that a little bit. As long as it may not be every day. That might not even be realistic. If you
Mm.
got a full-time employment, you're a parent, perhaps, as in
Yeah.
my case. I can't do this as a direct part of my employment. It has to be off the side of my desk.
Yeah.
So maybe what matters more than consistency is a system that works. So
Mm.
I landed on that language and sort of said, well, Friday mornings, it's my day off. I feel
Yeah.
like I'm at my best in the morning. If I can get my body moving beforehand and get to a coffee shop or my backyard, my back patio, or whatever, depending on the season, and
Yeah.
carve out minimum 2 hours, ideally even 3 or up to 4,
Mm.
because then I start to notice my peak sort of output diminishing or waning a little bit. So most often, most of the book got written on Friday mornings. Occasionally, I would be able to carve out a writing retreat. So
Yeah.
maybe 2 or 3 of those over the 3.5 year span that it took to actually write it. Um, I took a couple of
That's
extra
great.
holiday days
Yeah.
one year when I couldn't get away because COVID travel preventions and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, let's do a staycation and I'll write in the mornings. And so really love that. Like those weeks were highlights for me when I
Oh, that's
realized, oh,
great.
I really I can get into this. Like this
Mm.
felt so there was this sense of mutual energy exchange. Like
Yeah.
that all writing costs something. There is an
Yeah.
output, of course, but as I sort of settled into it for those retreats or those weeks or even just those moments on the Friday mornings,
Mm.
which isn't to say there weren't also moments where it was really hard, where I'm
Yeah.
not hitting my word count goals because I did set good goals as well. I would say, let's see, within the 2 or 3 hour window, I would try to write 1,000 words.
Mm.
And coupled with that was trying to learn a new writing style. Whereas 2 decades of preaching or teaching in classrooms with deadlines that
Mhm.
are a week or 2 days away, this
Yeah.
is the first long form thing that I've written. And so it's really easy, I should say, for those short form things to just be editing on the fly all the time.
Yeah.
And also good advice is don't pick up your pen. Just keep writing. Just let it flow. You can fix it
Mm.
later. That sort of idea. It was hard to
Yeah.
shift into that gear or to train my body to do that with any
Mhm.
consistency. But then the voices would come back like, it's okay. It's okay if you're editing on the fly most of the time. It's fine. If this works and it's going to
Yeah.
generate a book, keep at
Yeah.
it. So occasionally I'd push myself and I'd say, I'm going to write for 10 minutes without lifting my pen or keyboard, whatever it happened to be. And so
Yeah.
I'd push myself into that and could start to see little bits of fruit come from that practice. But then the other thing
Oh, that's so
also
good.
was
Yeah.
fine. Yeah. So there's a bunch
Mhm.
of stuff jumbled in there. But
That's
generally
great.
it was this
Yeah, great
notion. I
advice.
was grateful to not be pressed into a deadline. Like that was all up to
Mm.
me. And so
Mhm.
I set the goal. Let's see if we can get this by the time I turn 50. And that was at 47. And so it was in my 50th year, but it wasn't quite my 50th birthday. So
Well done. I mean, a lot of
yeah,
people,
thank you.
without some outside deadline,
Mm,
uh, don't finish a project like that. So that's just fantastic. And it
yeah.
sounds like you've got the writing bug. I mean, are you
Yeah.
working on other projects now?
Yeah. I've got, haven't really started other than, more, I don't know what I would call it. Just sort of research in the flow of life. I
Yeah.
have an Evernote bucket,
Okay,
that
good.
called book 2.
Yeah.
And, I have a working title and I have ideas and a basic structure and framework for what I think this one might become. And so
Fantastic.
that's in process for sure.
You chose the self-publishing route, which I
Mhm.
think is so good. I was so impressed with the quality of your
Mm.
book. How did that work out for you? That experience of self-publishing?
Well, shout out Chelsea McKenzie, who is my designer, and shout out Julia Kochuk, who is my editor. So my dream team of like the people who worked closest to me, I also had second readers and I had endorsement team and I had all those. So a lot of people that I would want to footnote as well
Amazing.
in gratitude. But And that was one of the good learnings as well, that as much as I really am an introvert, I do like the alone process, the solitude of it, but then I
Mm,
also love collaboration. And so
yeah.
getting a chance to work with that. And a good friend of mine, who's also an author, Brad Jerzak, I had a good session with him, and he gave me some counsel and said that for a first time author, self-publishing makes the most sense.
Hmm.
If you want to have any hope of making a little bit on this.
Yeah.
And yeah, the comparisons in terms of the margin, and even these days, if you go with a big publishing house, if you can get a contract, if you can even get an agent before that, the margins are very, very small in terms of what you might make on it. And
Very true.
uh, I saw the difference between that and self-publishing. And then when I realized if I know a good designer, it doesn't have to look like a self-published book, which back in the
Yeah,
day,
it's true. Such a new
nowadays it's
world.
really hard to
Yeah.
tell. Yeah. And then with the advent of print on demand, so like whether it is Amazon Kindle or I think it's called Kindle Digital Publishing, KDP,
Mm,
that's
hmm.
Amazon. And then
Yeah.
Ingram Spark, which is who I went with. Yeah, I don't have to guess at how many copies I'll need. I can just order them as I need them. And then
It's
the
incredible.
distribution to all the different wholesale and online
So
channels
people can
is built
any
in.
online retailer, they can get the growing
That's right.
season.
Yeah.
One of the things that I saw on your website, which I thought was so cool, is that you do events. Um, I don't know if you describe them as speaking events or book readings, but they double as wine tastings. Like you
Yeah,
kind of bring wine into the evening or the moment that you're gathered. What do those look like?
totally. Yeah. And I mean, so far there's two different types of events, I guess. One was simply book launch, which involved some reading and then some wine tasting and more out of the celebration. And those are events that I put on. But then I was also invited by a water charity called Acts for Water. And they do
Mm.
primarily work in Uganda. And their CEO read my book. Shout out Jeff Golby. And he read the book back in the early stages as well. And he said, I've got an idea for an event here and I wonder if you could come. People buy a ticket to a fundraising benefit type event to benefit our work
Yeah.
and help us taste some wine for a little bit. And we'll have some hors d'oeuvres and we'll have, different kinds of food pairings and that kind of stuff, depending on the setting. And then you and I can ping pong back and forth. You can read some bits from your book that touch on this journey of transformation and
Mm.
the different elements of wine and the soul. And then I'll say something about our work in Uganda, which is so much about transforming communities and not just
Yeah.
providing clean water, but also flourishing communities. And so we went back and forth like 4 or 5 times. I would read a short bit from a chapter, and then Jeff would come up and share a story, and then I would do this, and then
Oh,
back
it's
and
so
forth. And
cool.
so we're all nicely lubricated with the wine and the food. So we're happy. We believe in this cause. And
That's
so it was
great.
really lovely. Did that a few times this past year.
We Are you wanting to do kind of retreat kind of contexts or evening kind of gatherings where you would share from the book and then also have the wine tastings
Yeah,
happening?
that's a great question. Yeah, that feels like there is some possibility here. A retreat is compelling, even just an evening or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, trying to think through how to, yeah, would folks come to something like that with it,
Oh my
beyond the fact
gosh.
that I've just launched my book or that kind of idea. But I also want to grow in my wine knowledge because I've done, some entry
Yeah.
level formal training, but I'd like to have a bit more confidence or partner with somebody who really knows what they're
I just think
doing.
I
And
think it's an
yeah,
incredible idea. For anyone listening out there who wants to bring this to their church, don't tell your pastor you heard it from Josh Harris, but just bring the book and bring the idea because I'm telling
yeah,
you that would be such an amazing like
mm,
evening for a church or for a small group or for a leadership team. I think it's amazing. So I hope you do many of these.
oh, thanks for that
Uh,
encouragement. Yeah, it'd be fun.
um, you're also a jazz musician, which I think is
Great.
so cool. Where do you create time to play and perform?
Yeah, I mean that is very much a side hustle. There's a reason it's number 5 on my website, sort of offerings out of 5, 5 out of
Did
5.
you grow up
But
playing piano though?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. It was in the family for sure. My parents both sang and played piano, and I got introduced the opportunity to take lessons from a pretty early age. My mom was my first teacher.
Oh, cool.
Then she realized, I don't think I want this dual relationship of being mom and piano teacher. And so let's get him a real teacher now. And then so moved on from there, studied jazz at Capilano College in North Vancouver, ended up doing a 2-year diploma there. And then I got hired at the Bible college where I worked. And so I was fully intending to do a whole degree, but thought, well, no, we'll settle after 2 years. But I've been able to play professionally, mostly in a trio context. So yeah, available for, private functions and this and that, weddings, Christmas events and that
Oh,
kind of
that's so
stuff. So,
great.
and it really is, I've not been hustling, for gigs in the last, ever really since I graduated. It's just
Yeah.
when something comes my way, get an invitation. It's a lot of word of mouth and now a website. So
Well, you
see how it
mentioned
goes.
the podcast you were listening to related to music. Do you listen to a lot of
Yeah.
music podcasts? Do you
Oh,
have like a top 2 or 3 that you'd recommend to people?
absolutely. Yeah. I think the first one, that comes to mind is Song Exploder,
Song
where
Exploder. Okay.
yeah, where a musician or group sort of pick apart their songs and tell the story of how it was made. So it's mostly like focused on one artist, one song.
Oh, very
Um,
cool.
Another one related is Black Girl Songbook. And so our daughter is mixed race, and but I also just love Black R&B, soul, that whole
Mm,
sort of range. But I want
yeah.
my daughter to sort of feel seen and valued and understood as well. And I just love that whole style. And so Black Girl Songbook is a huge favorite, hosted by Danielle Smith, incredible journalist and an author. And then another one that I've been nerding out more recently is called 60 Songs That Explain the 90s. And that's
No
hosted
way.
by, it's incredible. It's hosted by a guy called Rob Harbilla, who's also a music journalist down in, I think he lives in Ohio, but has worked in a lot of different places, but
What a
long
great
form episodes. And
concept.
it's
Really.
fantastic.
And is
Highly entertaining.
each
Yeah,
episode is a single song and then they're unpacking how it affected the 90s or shaped the 90s?
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. But the way
Man,
he
the
comes
90s
at
are
it
back
as
so
well,
they're back so hard, aren't they?
they're
I just feel like
back
the
large.
90s,
Is that, yes, they
man,
are. It's true. Yeah. And it's, yeah, that's really good. Those
that's
are top
great.
3, I would say. Yeah.
That's really good. What about books? Are you reading
Mm.
anything that you're really
Yeah.
enjoying?
One of my favorite novels that I read in the past year was George Saunders' Lincoln in the Bardo. So
Mm,
George Saunders is mostly known for short stories, but he wrote a book called 10th of December, released several years ago, which I read. Man, I don't read a ton of short stories, but my editor
mm,
friend put me onto George Saunders, and I was just like, oh my goodness, this is incredible. And then his first really full length novel was called Lincoln in the Bardo. And
mm.
so Bardo is a South American term for purgatory. And so it was like the son of Abraham Lincoln, who was really sick. And the whole book takes place in the context of a night, but all the fantastical creatures and characters and historical figures that visit the son in the context of a night is the time span of the book.
Oh,
And so
wow,
it's
interesting.
wild. It's fantastical, imaginative, incredible writing, and it's really good. So on the novel front, that's what it was one of my favorites of the past year. And I'm reading one now called The Old Drift by Namwali Serpel. And that's also has this both historical, but also science fiction kind of elements to it. Pretty wild. Um, I'm reading a book called Freeing Jesus by Diana
Mm,
Butler Bass. And the subtitle has something to do with getting to know, or yeah, getting reacquainted with Jesus as friend, savior, Lord, way, some of these big words
oh,
that
interesting.
Jesus gets connected to. And so I really appreciate Diana Butler Bass's work.
Good stuff.
Yeah, those are probably some
That's
big
a
ones.
great
Yeah.
list. That's a great list. I thought it would be a cool way to close out our little
Mm,
conversation, if you don't mind, just to have you read a little selection from your
sure.
book, something that is meaningful to you, and that'll wrap up our little conversation.
Sure. Sure. Thanks, Josh. Thanks for the invitation. It's been really a delight, always a delight to spend time with you and
Oh man,
to
I really
chat. And
appreciate you coming on to talk. It's very
uh,
meaningful to me.
it's great. Okay, so brief context for this this is from the chapter called The Big Crush. And I did have a chance to work harvest at Incomeep Winery up in Osoyoos for just a week. It wasn't the whole
Mm,
season. was a very, very dipping my toe into it. And so one of the things I got to do was called punch downs. And punch downs are a way of extracting. So if you imagine in a fermentation room, really big, sort of high ceilinged room with several stainless steel tanks, let's say about 12 or 15 feet in diameter and, 10 feet off the ground. And so in this tank is a whole bunch of red grape juice, fermenting grape juice, and a thick layer of stems and seeds and skins sitting on top of that. It's intentional that that stuff stays there because most of the color and the flavor gets extracted from the skins and the seeds and the stems. And so in order to keep that process happening, you have to have the juice make contact with all of that, the stuff that's sitting on the top, and it's known as the cap. So I was doing punch downs, and that was part of the
punching
pain.
the cap down into the
I
liquid,
use
basically.
this tool that you punched it down all the way around this huge vat of fermenting kind of liquid, and in order to get that extraction sort of work going. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever done physically.
Oh my
It doesn't
goodness.
sound like it is, but it's really hard. So that's all you need for context for this. The caps in those tanks of Pinot Noir were tough and resistant. They had absolutely no desire to be broken up and submerged. Truth is, I didn't want to break them up either, especially the second time. I had felt enough punch down pain to know that this was going to hurt. I was resisting the resistance. I wanted someone else to do it, anyone but me, please. And yet, other parts of my life have taught me that there is such a thing as good pain, that a kind of beauty exists in sacrifice and self-giving, that loss and grief have the potential to change and transform us, to make us more resilient, more courageous, more open, and present to others.
The growing season. Nelson Boschman, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Thanks for listening to the Clear and Loud podcast. I'm your host, Josh Harris. Our producer is Pam Cameron, and this episode contains music by Jeremy Yaddo at Music for Podcasts. If you like what you hear, give us a boost by subscribing or leaving a review on Spotify or Apple or wherever you listen. We'd also love your feedback on today's episode. Or if you have a question you'd like addressed on a future episode or a guest you'd like us to consider, email us at hello@clearandloud.com. You can also shoot us a direct message on Instagram. Our handle is @clearandloud. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.